All right. So good afternoon. Glad to see a very full set of chairs here. Welcome to the Spring 2023 Dr. Thomas and Albert J. Shipka Speaker Series. We're happy to have you all here with us. Before I introduce our speaker, I'm going to say a couple of things about the people for which this series is named and why we're honoring them by having this series named after them. So the Shipka Speaker Series honors a father and son, Al Shipka and Dr. Tom Shipka. After graduating from Camel Memorial High School in 1932, Al Shipka was a steel worker in the Camel Works of the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company. As the years passed, he became president of his local union, a member of the staff and assistant director of the United Steelworkers of America, District 26. He was president of the Greater Youngstown AFL-CIO Council and the first representative of organized labor to be appointed to the YSU Board of Trustees. He passed away in 1975. His son, Dr. Tom Shipka, earned his PhD in philosophy and served on the YSU full-time faculty from 1969 to 2006. He helped organize and lead the faculty union from 1971 to 1986 and chaired the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies from 1986 to 2006. He served as a fundraiser for both academics and athletics throughout his YSU career. He received a Distinguished Professor Award 3 times for his teaching and scholarship, including a widely used text for introductory philosophy. He didn't mention this, but I'll also mention that he won the Watson Merit Award twice, which is an award for chairs that involves the faculty of the chair actually nominating him. So the fact that he won the Watson Merit Award twice is quite a big deal. So it speaks very highly to his leadership in that department. His gifts to YSU include an endowed scholarship for a student athlete, and Dr. Shipka was inducted into the YSU Athletic Hall of Fame as a contributor in 2004 and the YSU Heritage Society in 2009. I'm kind of curious as to which one of those two he actually values more. I suspect it's the athletics area, but we can ask him after the talk. One of Dr. Shipka's fundraising activities was a group we call the Philosophy Circle, and the Philosophy Circle is a generous group of donors who've made it possible for the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences to bring world-class speakers like Dr. Brennan to YSU. So please join me in thanking Tom for all his efforts to support the students, employees of YSU, as well as the wider Youngstown community. And Tom, if you would stand up, please, for us. Okay, so before I introduce the speaker, 2 final things. First, put your phones on silent. But second, after the talk, there's a reception right over and behind the Chestnut Room with food, so please join us. If you don't get a chance to ask a question of our speaker right after he is done with his talk, then you feel free to approach him and ask questions at the reception. And so please join us and eat the food that's there. All right. So our speaker for today is Dr. Jason Brennan. Dr. Brennan is the Robert J. and Elizabeth Flanagan Family Professor of Strategy, Economics, Ethics, and Public Policy, and the director of the Georgetown Institute for the Study of Markets and Ethics at the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University. He's the editor of Public Affairs Quarterly and an associate editor of Social Philosophy and Policy, and oversees a $2.1 million Templeton Foundation grant on markets, social entrepreneurship, and effective altruism. He's the author of over 16 books and over 80 journal articles and book chapters, and his books have been translated into numerous languages around the world. I'm particularly excited to have him with us today as I've used his work in classes. His writing is refreshing and accessible. His work mixes empirical data and philosophical argumentation, and he does a masterful job of giving a fresh look at claims that we all take for granted and showing that maybe the commonly held views are less than justified. For example, in his 2011 book, The Ethics of Voting, he argues against the idea that we should all be voting, and among other conclusions argues that, quote, most citizens have a moral obligation to refrain from voting, even if they have a right to vote. That's a quote, so it's not me misrepresenting his view. So if you've heard me talk before, you usually hear me saying, go vote, and so this is the opposite, right? So I'm not bastardizing his view. Okay. So today we'll be hearing him talk about part of the argument and a little bit more from his 2016 book, Against Democracy. Last night at dinner, someone jokingly asked, why do you hate democracy? And we all laughed, and Dr. Brennan replied, I don't. I love it the proper amount. I love it, I love it enough to look at it honestly and point out its flaws. That might be paraphrased a little bit, but I think I got the right idea. Right? So I would hope that we'd all strive to be as honest regarding the flaws of social views that we hold dear. So please join me in welcoming to the stage Dr. Jason Brennan.
All right, is this on? You can hear me? Thanks for having me back here. It's good to be back here in Ohio. My wife is actually from Willoughby. I went to school at Case Western, so I had friends who lived in Youngstown. I know this area really well. And so it's always nice to come back, and I'll probably be back here again in like 2 more months. I'm really happy to talk with you guys today about democracy. And what I want to do is talk about how democracy works, what you were taught about it, and then the truth. All right? Because the thing you were taught in 6th grade, I have a 6th grader right now, you get taught a certain model of what makes democracy work and therefore why it's justified. But basically every part of that model is mistaken. Right? And so what I'm going to do today is tell you how it really works, and then we're going to talk about what should we do about it. Right? So basically the 2 theories we're going to talk about is what you might call the popular sovereignty theory of democracy, or the populist theory, or what I like to call the 6th grade model, because it's the thing you get taught in 6th grade civics classes. And then we're going to learn about something called democratic realism, a more pessimistic but realistic account of what democracy is actually doing. So here's how this 6th grade model works. It's very intuitive. Basically, it says something like this. Each of you has a set of things that you care about. You have values. Those values don't have to be just yourself. You might care about the environment. You might care about social justice. You might care about a wide range of concerns other than your pocketbook. And then what you do is you learn how the world works. You discover some facts about economics and about government and about policy and about this and that. And on the basis of your values and your understanding of how the world works, you form something like an ideology. That is, an organized set of views about what justice requires and what the government ought to do or ought not to do, or even whether the government ought to exist at all. Right? It doesn't have to be as robust as a full political philosophy, but at the very least you have a policy bent towards certain ideas. Then the next step is each one of us looks around all the various political parties on offer, and we find the one that best matches our view, and we vote for them. Or if we realize they have no chance in hell of actually winning, we might go with the 2nd or 3rd or 4th best in order to pick something that has a good chance of going for our views. At the same time, politicians, I'm surrounded by politicians. I live in the DC area. One of my neighbors is my congressperson, and everyone else works for the government. I'm like the only non-government person on my street, basically. What they do is they want power and they want to win. So in the same way that Chipotle competes for your dollars to get you to buy them a burrito from them, the politicians are trying to compete for your votes. So what they try to do is figure out what will it take to get people to vote for me. We'll offer them the policies that they want. Everyone does this. And then at some point, we vote. And what happens is the politicians who match, if not necessarily everybody, not necessarily the majority, but at least a sizable percentage of the population get elected on the basis of having the policies those people want. And then as a result, when they go into office, they try to implement those policies over 2 to 3 or 4 or 6 years, depending on what their term is. And then when they come up for re-election, we, the voters, pay attention to what they did. And if they did a good job, we re-elect them. If they did a bad job, we vote the bastards out. It's a very good story, and if that were true, it would say a lot on behalf of democracy. It would still have real problems, like the problem of persistent minorities, people who maybe just never get their way because there aren't that many of them. It would still be the problem of maybe the majority can exploit the minority. Maybe in some cases, the minority can exploit the majority in a democracy. It wouldn't be perfect, but at the very least, it would be like you are taking the people's will, or at least a large segment of the people's will, and converting it into power. Right? Democracy is a way of giving a large percentage of people what they want on the basis of what they care about and what they know. If that were the truth about democracy, that would explain why it's so much better of a system than other systems. Unfortunately, almost everything I said was false. Almost every step of that process is mistaken for most voters. Not all of them, but for most. Right? So what's going on with democracy? The great philosopher and economist and feminist author John Stuart Mill wrote a defense of representative government, not democracy per se, he's actually something else, called Considerations on Representative Government. And he had this hypothesis that getting the average person to participate in politics would enlighten and ennoble them. It would be like getting a fish to discover that there's a world outside of the ocean. All right, maybe he's right, but he didn't know. He was speculating because he didn't really have the data or the evidence to back this up. The great Austrian economist and social theorist Joseph Schumpeter had a different hypothesis. He thinks that when people participate in politics, they start reasoning like cave people. They become primitives again. They reason in a way that they would recognize as infantile in the sphere of their legitimate interests. But he was also speculating because he didn't really have the evidence or anything to back it up. But now we do. Things have changed. So starting in like around 1958, political scientists and economists started doing really serious, heavy empirical work looking at what voters know, how they reason, how they react to information, what they don't know, and so on. And the results are very depressing. Basically, Schumpeter was right and Mill was wrong. And I say that as a big fan of Mill. I'm one of his biggest fans. What are really people? It turns out that people vary a lot in how they behave in politics, how they think, but we can kind of simplify it into two basic categories, which I like to call hobbits and hooligans. So have you all seen, like, you've read The Lord of the Rings or you've seen the movies? All right, so you might remember hobbits in The Lord of the Rings. Even though the ones you pay attention to are going on a big adventure, they're weird. The typical hobbit just wants to stay at home, smoke their pipe, eat their breakfast and their second breakfast and their levensies and lunch and second lunch and so on. And they don't care about the grand cosmic battle between good and evil happening on Middle Earth. Right? The political analog of this would be the typical non-voter, say in the United States. When you look at the typical person who chooses not to vote despite having the right to vote, what you find is this. They have very few political opinions. They don't really care much about either party. If you ask them their opinion on something and ask them a week later, they'll give you a different opinion. They just don't really care much about politics. They just care about other stuff. You know what? And God bless them for that. That's fine. Right? I do politics for a living in a way, but that doesn't mean you have to. I love Iron Maiden, and I'm going to use them as an example later in class, not because you're here, but just because I always do, and just by luck, there's an Iron Maiden fan here. But I don't judge people who don't like Iron Maiden. Well, I kind of do, but I don't really. Right? It's fine. If you like Taylor Swift more than Iron Maiden, that's fine. You don't have to like what I like. We like different things, though Iron Maiden's better. All right. What about other people? So if you've ever gone to a sports game, right, how do fans there act? A little differently. They care a lot. Back in 1998, I was in Jacobs Field wearing my Red Sox gear during a Division Series game where the Red Sox blew out the Indians 23-6. What a great game that was. All right, sorry. I've been to a lot of Indians games. I've been to like probably 40 or 50, but I was wearing the Red Sox gear that day. They're my second team after the Red Sox. So what were the fans like? As you're not be surprised, they weren't super nice to me. I heard a lot of F-bombs. An old woman in front of me said, "Go back to Beantown," that kind of thing. What are sports fans like? Especially think about soccer fans in countries where people care about soccer. Right? I one time went to a soccer game in Brazil, and like they separated the fans into different sections of the stadium. And they had cops keeping them up, metal barriers, barricades outside, because they literally would fight each other. Our concierge at my hotel said you have to wear the color gray so you don't get beaten up, and he meant it, and it was true. Right? Sports fans know a lot about sports. They often know facts. They can recite like what happened in particular games at particular times and who hit what or kicked what or caught what, but they're very biased in how they assess the information. So for instance, when Tom Brady was accused of deflating footballs, what did people from New England say? Was he guilty? No, they got the right answer. All right. And then the rest of the country, what do they say? Was he guilty? Yeah. Do you think he's guilty? Yes. All right. Sorry about that. Right. I'm from New England originally, so of course I side with Tom Brady, greatest ever, and you all know it. Right? Anyways, but what's going on there? It's like I don't have access to any information that you don't have. It's not like Bob Kraft called me and was like, "Jay, just so you know, he really didn't do it. Here's proof." It's because I'm from New England, I want to think Tom Brady's good. And because you're not, you're happy to think he's bad, right? He'd spent 20 years dominating the league and people are pissed at him. We kind of reason in a way that we want. Or similarly, like my brother-in-law who lives in Brecksville he's a Yankees fan because he's originally from New York. If I'm watching a Yankees-Red Sox game and like my guy comes into home plate and gets tagged out, I'm like, he's safe, he's blind. And he's like, he's not safe, obviously he's guilty. We're reasoning in a biased way because I want my team to win and he wants his team to win. It turns out that the typical person who votes in the United States is like this with regard to their politics. They reason in a very similar kind of way. They know more information, but they're extremely biased in how they process that information. For instance, they'll only read or watch news stations that correspond to their political views. So if you're a Democrat, what channel do you watch? Yeah. If you're a Republican, what do you got? Yeah. If you're a Libertarian, you don't get a TV show, but you might watch you might read like Reason magazine. If you're a Marxist, you get the sociology department, right? So you find the thing that corresponds to what you think. And you're also a jerk to people with whom you disagree. So like you might be like, oh, I'm friends with you, but I found out that you're a Republican and I'm a Democrat. We can't be friends anymore. It's very common, right? Why? So that's how people are with regard to sports. In a way, if you've ever seen Star Trek, I'm not a Trekkie, but if you've ever seen Star Trek, you know about Vulcans, and they're like, I can't quite do it. They're like ideally rational, like, is it like this? Perfectly rational people. In a way, what John Stuart Mill was saying is like, people are hobbits, but if we get them to participate in politics, they'll become Vulcans. And Schumpeter was saying, if we get them to participate in politics, they'll become hooligans. Well, unfortunately, our evidence is that the hooligan thesis is correct. They become more and more hooliganish, right? What's really going on with voters? One thing is, it turns out voters are surprisingly unopinionated. It seems like they're opinionated, but they're not really. It's a very implausible hypothesis on its face because people won't shut up about their opinions. So why would I possibly think that? What's really going on for them? Well, one thing that's surprising is actually a lot of people really don't have much in the way of political opinions at all. You go up and interview them and they're like, I don't know. But the other thing is when you ask people and you poll them about their political opinions, people don't like to say I don't know on an opinion poll. Anyone here a marketing major? All right, no one? All right, I don't know if you have marketing here actually. So if any of you go into marketing, you should know this. People do not like to say I don't know when you poll them, so they will make up an opinion on a spot. But to know if they really know it, you have to ask them the same question again at different times. Some of the earliest studies that were done on political behavior just did this. They asked, like Converse back in the 50s and 60s, went around asking tens of thousands of American voters, what's your opinion on 5 major political things? And he did it year after year after year, and he found a 0 correlation between their opinion in one year and another year. They're basically just picking something at random. That's a pretty large percentage of the population. But what about the other people that seem opinionated? What are they really doing? What's really happening in politics? Here's what I want to explain what politics is fundamentally about for most of us. Think about the ritual of giving somebody an engagement ring. All right? I've done this. Back in 2002, my, at the time, girlfriend, who's from Willoughby, Ohio, we were living in Arizona together, and I spent lots and lots of money I barely had to buy her an expensive engagement ring and had this beautiful sort of ceremonial day where we did all this stuff. We went to like a Frank Lloyd Wright thing, and then I said, we're going to build the architecture of our lives together. It was very poetic, and I got down on her knee and I gave her a ring. Why? Why did we do that? What's the purpose behind that? Here's why we do it. It makes sense. Because you can just be driving in a car and be like, we actually just like, should we get married? Yeah, we should really think we should get married. Like, we should get married, right? But you don't know how serious I am. But if I spent thousands of dollars on a trinket, that's really strong proof. It also shows I'm at least somewhat financially stable because I can afford it. It's proof of commitment. You could have an alternative ceremony where like, will you marry me? And as proof that I really love you, I'm going to cut my arm open and bleed for an hour, and I'm going to burn $10,000. Like, wow, he's financially stable and he means it. That's why we do it. That's the purpose behind it. It happens to be a ring. If diamonds were suddenly cheap, we wouldn't have cheap engagement rings. We would switch to something else, or we'd make the rest of the sort of ceremony more expensive. You see other elements of this. Like in certain religions, you have practices that are costly. You might have to forbear from eating good food, or cut off certain parts of your body, or go do some stuff that's kind of costly for your time, right? Or think about this. This is a guy from the MS-13 gang. His face is covered with tattoos. Why do they do this? Well, the MS-13 gang has a problem. To succeed, they need to work together and trust one another. But their members are not very trustworthy. After all, they're criminals and murderers and rapists and thieves. How could they possibly know that they're going to be able to trust each other? Well, the fact that I'm willing to accept certain initiation behaviors, like you allow me to beat me up, do costly stuff outside of this, and cover myself with tattoos that alienate me from the rest of the world, is a very strong signal that I am a loyal member of your gang. And it works. It makes them trust one another. So a lot of this stuff is done for social benefits. Even sports. right? I like sports. A lot of you like sports. Some of you are wearing sports shirts. Sports are cool. They're fun to play and they're fun to watch, but they also have a social function, right? It tells us something about that you're loyal to your area. So when I was like growing up in the outer Boston suburbs, if I'm wearing a Red Sox shirt, that tells people I'm one of you, right? I care about Boston, right? And the fact, if I'm super biased in favor of the team, like imagine like a guy's coming into home plate and he gets tagged over there and like home plate's over here. And I'm like, he's blind, he's obviously safe. The rest of you are gonna be like, I mean, no, but you know what? Jay's a really good fan. He really loves the Red Sox. I kind of like Jay for that, even though he's saying something that's absurd. The fact that he's that loyal, that he'll like say the guy's safe when the home plate's over there, wow, right? So I actually get a benefit for being irrationally in love with the Red Sox, at least among other Red Sox fans, not so much among Yankees fans, right? What if that's what's going on with politics? Effectively, what democratic realism says is this is what is happening with politics. Why? Because unfortunately, your vote doesn't matter much. So it would make sense for you to use your vote this way. Right? Why would you vote otherwise? Right? That's the basic claim. When people are engaged in politics, for most people, politics is not about policy. Or as Kwame Appiah says, people vote for who they are, not what they want. So what's the theory? What's the sort of model going on here? The basic idea is something like this. Most people have a sense of their identity. This is a socially constructed thing. It can vary over time, but you have a sense of who you are. I am a Boston Irish Catholic. I am a white Southern evangelical. I am, a New York Jewish person. Whatever that might be, you have a sense of that's who you are. And then what they do is they look around and they find out other people with the same identity tend to vote for the same party, and they just copy them. I vote, and it's a way of sort of showing that I'm a member of the group, and it gets me social benefits for doing so. Why do they vote for this party over the other? A lot of evidence says it's largely accidental. People get attached to parties not because that party serves their interests, but for basically arbitrary reasons. And some test of this, there's a really good book on this called Democracy for Realists that you can read, and they'll go through some of the things that show this. Like the Great Depression hits, and pretty much all Jewish people in Canada switched from voting from the left-wing party to the right-wing party, and basically identical Jewish people in the United States switched from voting from the right-wing party to the left-wing party, right? If it were a result of, well, we've learned something about depressions and we're changing on the basis of real information, you'd expect them to change the same way, but they don't. Right? And a lot of stuff looks like that. It's just this kind of arbitrary thing. It used to be if you were a Southern evangelical, you voted for the Democrats, and then over time it became the Republicans. And you're just sort of showing that you're one of them. And you don't necessarily believe or know what they advocate or anything else. You're an artist, so you vote green. So it might be something like this. Now, some people, they just end there. They actually don't have much in the way of political opinion. They don't even know what their party stands for, and they don't share their party's politics. But then some people do. Some people are very good at reciting what their party stands for. According to the realist theory, though, the direction of causation is different from what you think. It's not, I have these opinions, you're the politician that matches my opinions, so I'm going to vote for you. It's rather, I'm voting for you to impress them, and I find out, to really impress them, I find out what it is you think, and I carbon copy it. Whatever you say, I go along with it. So it might be like, I'm a Boston Irish guy. People like me vote Democrat. I'll vote Democrat. Oh, the Democrats are pro-choice, so I'll be pro-choice too. Now, right now, I'm just giving you a model. You should not believe this is true yet. Maybe it sounds a little plausible, but I haven't given you evidence for it. Why think it's true? What's the evidence for this? Well, one thing is a weird phenomenon of belief convergence that's hard to explain otherwise. So for instance, suppose I have here a person who is opposed to gun control. What is this person's view on climate change? Is it real? Yeah? Is it man-made? Should we do something about it? Yeah, right. You know what they think about climate change from that one thing. I have over here a person who thinks we should reduce federal taxes on income taxes. What's their view of abortion? They don't like it. They don't like it. Those things have nothing to do with one another. They're completely logically independent. Why is it people converge on these beliefs? Well, because they're matching what their party says. And so some people go, oh no, it makes sense. The Democrats are just right, so they converge on the truth, right? But then why are the Republicans going the other way? Why wouldn't they just have like random scattered beliefs? It's puzzling, but it gets worse. One thing is the incongruence of their beliefs and their actions. So for instance, my father, who lives in Florida, is the kind of person who would be like, respect the flag. How dare you desecrate the flag? He also loves to desecrate the flag because he likes to wave that flag, right? He's a flag desecrator. I think it's actually fine to desecrate the flag, but I never do it because it's like not my thing. He thinks it's evil to do it, and he does it all the time. He puts up this desecrated flag. What the hell? Right? Or in my neighborhood, If you walk around where I live, you'll see this sign in a bunch of people's yards. No human is illegal. You know what? They don't think that. I'm an open borders person. I actually do advocate the idea that everyone should be able to move everywhere. They don't. They're in favor of 99.6% restricted abortion, but they're pissed at the people who are in favor of 99.7% restricted abortion. Sorry, not abortion, immigration. They don't actually think that. Their view is like most human beings are legal and should be allowed to move here. Further, they have this sign up that says Black Lives Matter. And I think they probably do that. But I put up a sign here showing you a map of the DC area. So there's Washington, DC. That's the Potomac. That's the Anacostia River. That's the beginning of the Chesapeake Bay. DC is like kind of in the middle there. That's Virginia. That's Maryland. Every red dot is a white person. Every blue dot is a black person. What do you notice? Super duper segregated, right? As I mentioned before, most of my neighbors work downtown. They're working for the government. They could afford to live right here in this area, which is the richest black majority county in the United States and one of the richest counties, period, full of super highly educated black people. And they don't. They'd rather live with the other white people. Right? And they're willing to pay more for their houses to do that. So they have this sign, but they don't really act upon it, do they? Right? All right? What are the things? Another thing that's kind of really depressing about this is politics appears to mess up how we reason. So Dan Kahan is basically a psychologist at Yale's law school. He's done a series of famous studies asking people to sort of test their math ability. And he'll give them fake data and go, hey, subjects, I'm giving you fake data. This is not real. I made it up. I'm just asking you, if this data were real, what would it say? Some people can't do the math, but some people can. And he'll make it about their ability, like toothbrushing. Like, is this toothpaste effective against cavities? People get the right answer on that one. But then what he'll do is give them exactly the same numbers, exactly the same fake data, but make it about gun control. And he'll go, once again, just to be clear, this is a fake study. You understand, check here, you understand, right? This is a fake study, it's all made up. Got it? Good. All right? This is a fake study about gun control. And guess what happens? The people who were able to do the math before now mess it up. What happens is if you're a pro-gun control person, you interpret his fake data as supporting gun control regardless of what it says. And if you're an anti-gun control data person, you interpret his made-up data as showing that you're right regardless of what it says. And the better people are at doing math, the worse they are at this. The more they engage in this kind of motivated reasoning, converging on the beliefs they want to believe, even though they've been told it's fake. Right? Weird. Why would they do that? It gets worse. You might have heard about studies, like for instance, if in the United States, if you have two identical resumes and one person's name is Robert Kennedy and the other's name is Saddam Hussein, which person's more likely to get a call back for the job? Right? Yeah, exactly. So you know that like people will discriminate against each other on the basis of things like their names, their identity, and so on. It turns out that the strongest instance of this has to do with politics. So a number of studies have been done looking at things like you have two resumes and you don't mark them with regard to politics at all. People will pick the resume that's really stronger. I'd rather have the quarterback, the first string quarterback than the second string quarterback. I'd rather have a person who graduated with a 4.0 than a person with a 3.0. I'd rather have a physics major than a communications major, et cetera, et cetera. But if you put political identification on there, what happens is Democrats heavily discriminate in favor of Democratic candidates to the point where the other qualifications no longer have any statistically significant effect on whether you hire the person. And Republicans do the same thing for Republicans. Lots and lots of studies with very similar kinds of things. Back in the 1960s, if you asked people, hey, you're a Democrat, would you be okay with your kid marrying a Republican? They'd go, yeah, that's fine. Only about 1 out of 20 people would say no. Nowadays, the majority of people who are partisans say, I absolutely would hate that. They don't befriend people. They don't go out with people. They don't like to work with people who have different political views. Right? We have this antipathy towards one another. Do most people even believe anything? What will be our evidence that they do or they don't? There's a couple weird things that show this. One is you go and ask people what they believe, and a lot of them just say, I don't know. But another thing is you ask them the same question time after time after time, and they give you different answers. So imagine I go up to you and say, what's your view on gun control? And you're like, I don't know, yay. And then I ask you like a month later, and you're like, boo. And I go, this is how the studies work. A month ago, I asked you this question, and you gave me a different answer. Why did you change your mind? The most common response is, what are you talking about? I've always thought this. I didn't change my mind. 70 years of studies showing that phenomenon. It makes it sound like they don't really believe it. They're just saying what they think they're supposed to say. Oops, I messed it. Another thing is, you might have seen like Jimmy like late night TV show hosts do this kind of thing where party platform. What do you think of it? And they'll like defend it. And they're like, haha, it's actually the Democratic Party platform. No, it's not. It works for Democrats as well. You can trick people. If you really, really understood what your party stood for, you wouldn't be tricked. Like if you came up to me and you're like, libertarians, they love protectionism. I'd be like, no, they don't. That's like the exact opposite of libertarianism. But this works for almost all voters who are Democratic and Republican. You can just trick them into like giving them the opposite party's views and they'll defend it. If you ask them, hey, you're a Democrat, you always vote Democrat, what do the Democrats stand for? They'll get it wrong. Even like the belief in consistency, they'll switch on a dime for weird reasons and not know that they switched. A really nice example of this would be, and by the way, this is true for Democrats, I'm just gonna give you a Republican example, but think about what happened in 2016 with regard to the Republicans. In the beginning of 2016, the typical Republican would self-report that they are pro-free trade. And then a protectionist candidate, Donald Trump, became the presumptive nominee. And then you ask the same Republicans, a lot of whom said they would never vote for Trump, but then did, why did you change your mind about protectionism? The most common response is not, this would be perfectly valid. You know, I was a protectionist, but then Donald Trump gave me a really good argument and I changed my mind. That's fine, that happens. I mean, you should be anti-protectionist, but whatever, that happens, right? That's not what they said though. They said, no, I've always been protectionist. I didn't change my mind, right? Or think about what's happening with regard to Russia. So Akins and Bartels, they talk about this as a great example. You would have thought opposition to Russia is a fixed part of the Republican mentality, but now you have a lot of Republicans that are like, I kind of side with Russia against Ukraine. And you would have thought that being a peacenik is a fixed part of the Democratic mentality, but now a lot of Democrats are like really warmongering when it comes to Ukraine. What the hell? How'd that happen? Why did they change their minds? If you ask them why they changed their minds, their answer is, what are you talking about? I've always thought that. But did they? So a really good book to read on this kind of stuff is a book called Neither Liberal Nor Conservative, which looks over 70 years of studies on this point. And their high estimate is that maybe 15 out of 100 Americans is genuinely ideological and actually votes for the party on the basis of real ideology. The other 85% are engaged in a kind of social signaling. With regard, by the way, to that, I've always thought that. Let me give you an example. A lot of you are young, you don't really remember this, but for the older people, remember when LeBron left the first time? Right? Yeah, so again, I'm not from Ohio, but I went to school at Case. I have a lot of in-laws are in Ohio. I can remember what they said. And they were like, a week before he announces a couple months before it's even a threat he might leave, they're like, LeBron James is probably the greatest basketball player of all time. He's going to be better than Michael Jordan, right? An arguable claim, right? Is he the best? If he's not number one, he's maybe number two, right? He's really great. But then when he threatens to leave, you know what they say? I always thought he was overrated, right? I'm going to burn his shirt. I always thought he was overrated. They're not lying. They're sincere. They're just wrong. It's like a week ago, this happens when Tom Brady leaves New England, right? He's the greatest of all time, but then it's like Jimmy down at the Lansdowne pub. He's always a bit overrated, I think. He was really Belichick. Though, he left on good terms with us, so a lot of us still worship him. All right, so again, how to summarize what's going on here. According to the popular sovereignty theory of democracy, you have your values, you understand how the world works, and you vote for the party that matches your thing, and as a result, the party puts your views into power. Democratic realism says, nah, mostly what you're doing is engaging a kind of socialist signaling with one another, and as a result, elections happen. Elections are effectively random events that do not reflect the will of the people, in part because not only is there not a will of the people as a whole, there's barely even a will of the person. The typical voter does not have a political will. The people who do, who have a genuine political will, are a tiny minority. Mostly it's about waving flags, forming in-groups and out-groups. It's akin to sports fandom, but not as fun because football's way better than politics when it comes to as a viewing thing, right? But it gets worse. What else are people up to? Well, one interesting kind of finding is people know very little about politics. What voters don't know about politics could fill a library, and I mean that literally because every stuff in the library they don't know. They literally know basically nothing. For decades and decades, we've been studying how much do voters know, and the answer is the typical voter knows next to nothing. You give them a multiple choice test every couple years, and what you find is the top 20, and this is like on very basic political facts, who's your congressperson, who's the whatever. What you find is like the top 25% of voters get like a B+ on that. The next middle percent, 50%, they pretty much get like a quarter of the questions right. And since it's a multiple choice test, we don't know if that means they knew 1 out of 4 answers or if they're just literally doing the same as chance. They're just guessing. And the bottom 25% do worse than chance. So for instance, in the 2000 national election studies, they ask voters, hey, who's more conservative, Gore or Bush, the second? And a whopping like 59% of them knew it was Gore. I'm sorry, knew that Bush was more conservative. Then they asked them like follow-up questions. Okay, who's more in favor of welfare rights, environmental protection, women's rights, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And the majority of people didn't know the answer. So they're like, I know there's this word conservative. I know it applies to you and not you, and I don't know what the word means. And these are the people who vote. The people who don't vote know even less. Why are they like that? What's explaining this? It's a problem endemic to the way democracy works. It's because of an incentive structure. So just to illustrate this incentive structure, imagine that this is a class, and you are all my students, and I'm a radically egalitarian professor. So I say the following: 15 weeks from now, we're going to have a test in my Biology 101 class. And instead of you getting your grade, and you getting your grade, and you're getting your grade, I'm going to average all of your grades together on this one final exam, and everyone will get the same grade. What do you think the average grade will be? Will it be high or low? Low. Why? It's not because you're lazy. It's not because you're stupid. It's not because you're bad. It's because you reason as follows. If I work really hard on this, I'm still going to get the same grade as everybody else. I will bear all the consequences of studying for basically no benefit, not even to the other people. But if I just watch Netflix for 15 weeks, it will cost me basically nothing. I think the math works out to be like, imagine there's 1,000 students in the class. If the average grade was going to be a 30 without you, with the other 999 students, and you get 100, you move it up from like a 30 to like a 30.7. You're not even doing other people a favor by studying. It's a collective action problem. It's the same as the climate problem. Right? If you, let's say, I don't know what you drive, but let's say you have like a Corvette that gets really low gas mileage, and you switch to a Tesla, thanks, but you haven't really helped. Doesn't really matter. What matters is what we do, not what you do. Right? It matters how we act collectively. So this is what's going on for voters. They kind of recognize, I can afford to indulge my ignorance. I can afford to just not know anything. I can afford to indulge my bias because my individual behavior does not matter. And that is by design. That's how democracy is supposed to work. If you had a massive effect on democratic outcomes, something is going wrong. No offense to you, same for me. No, like it shouldn't be like that. It's supposed to be what we think, not what you think, not what you think. If one person has a lot of power in democracy, it's not really democratic. But the problem is you're incentivizing people to be ignorant and to remain misinformed and to use their votes for purposes other than policy because your individual vote makes very little difference. There's a bit of a debate in political science about how much a vote matters, and there's a couple different models, but even on the most optimistic model out there, they say that your chances of breaking a tie in an election are pretty much vanishingly small unless you live in like one of a few swing states. So back in 2016, congratulations Ohioans, your votes actually had something on that model, maybe a 1 in 10 million chance of deciding the election. That's really high. My vote had like a 1 in 100 million. Right? People in California, their votes had like a 1 in 250 trillion chance. Effectively zero. And that's on the optimistic model. Individual votes don't make much of a difference, and they're not supposed to. But voters behave that way on purpose. Think about how this is going to affect your behavior. Like imagine I'm like walking across the street, and I'm about to cross. I look both ways. And imagine a Mack truck is barreling towards me, and a thought occurs to me. That's not an ordinary Mack truck. That's actually Optimus Prime, my childhood hero from the Transformers, coming to take me on an adventure to fight Megatron together, which I would love to do. If you're here, Optimus Prime, let's do it. Like, wait till the talk's over, let's do it. All right? I would not dare indulge that bias or that crazy belief, because if I'm wrong, what happens? The world will punish me for being wrong. And I used to work as an insurance adjuster, so I can tell you that people do sometimes indulge those beliefs, but if they survive, they learn to be better. But when it comes to politics, I can afford to indulge anything. The QAnon conspiracy theory, if I decide to believe in that right now, all that happens to me is some people like me more and some people like me less. My voting behavior has no effect on politics. And that's true for you. And that's why we behave the way that we do. Right? So people tend not to know very much. They tend not, almost anything I think they should know, they don't know it. I won't go through all the examples right now. Right? But knowledge has a pretty big effect on people's behavior. One clear is like, what if people are smart in groups? And we can maybe talk about this during Q&A. There's a lot of attempts to kind of show maybe we average it out. But basically, all these various theorems that say maybe we're smart as a group but not smart as individuals work only if people are really trying to solve a problem, if they cooperate with one another, and if they don't have systematic error. But in fact, people are not using politics for that purpose, and they do engage in systematic errors and have systematic biases. So these things don't quite work. So what should we do about it? Well, all right, one hypothesis, I'm going to skip to this part here. One hypothesis is that we need better education. I'm an educator. That sounds really good. I kind of like to believe that. It's not going to fix the problem. Here's why. Has anyone here ever studied for a test, gotten a good grade, and then forgotten the material? Okay. Yeah, right. Me too. I was a chemistry major for 3 years. If you knew me at age 19, I could like synthesize chemicals in a laboratory, like with like much prep. I don't remember what a ketone is right now. I know there's something called a ketone. I think it has oxygen. I don't know what it is anymore, right? I barely know it was in some of the articles I wrote in like 2007, right? I don't think I could recite my dissertation to you. I don't know like the phone number of my best friend in high school anymore. It's gone. Why did I let it go? I don't need it anymore. I do an experiment with my students sometimes. You'll do this in my second week of class in their freshman year, and I'll come in and give them a quiz that's based upon, here's 5 questions that are taken from level 1 United States sort of scholarship, like class materials for your sophomore year of high school. My students, they basically all have straight A's when they come into college. That's the kind of students we have. And I say, if you get 5 out of 5 questions on this quiz right now, I will give you $50 on the spot, right? Some math questions, some history questions, some like reading stuff. The best any student at Georgetown has ever done on this is 4 out of 5. 2 people managed to do that this past fall. Amazing. Before that, the record was 3 out of 5. The modal is 2 out of 5. I'm literally like, I'm paying you to get the answers right. They forgot it all. They remember, so they basically forget the material that they need. This is what's happening with education. We do, in fact, teach people a lot of what they need to do to be informed voters by the time they graduate from 12th grade, and they forget it all. They forget almost all of it. In fact, most of what you learn in college, you'll forget. On average, people retain about 20% of the information that they learn in school. They mostly retain it if they find it interesting or useful. Most people don't find this information particularly interesting and useful, so they don't remember it and they forget it. If we have them do extra education, it won't make a difference. And in fact, this is a real bummer as a professor. Getting a bachelor's degree predicts that you'll only get about 1 extra question right on the Pew Poll of political knowledge. Going from high school, like the Pew Poll has about 30 questions of basic political knowledge. Going from having a high school diploma to having a bachelor's degree predicts 1 extra question right. Education has almost no effect on how much people know about politics. And the reason is for the reason that you forgot that stuff. And me too. I did exactly the same thing. I'm no different. Right? So what do we do? What are some other possibilities? What are some other alternatives? Well, this is when it gets to be a hard thing. What do you think we should do? How do we handle this? One thing is we might just say, maybe we can live with it. Maybe we should just admit democracy is the best form of government, worst form of government except all the others. It still outperforms the other forms of government. We'll just suck it up and just accept it has systematic flaws. So I like to say, again, not because you're here, I always use Iron Maiden as my example. I think Iron Maiden's a great band, but they have real flaws. Some of those albums in the 90s really sucked, right? And basically when Bruce is not the singer, I don't really like it, right? So not everything they do is amazing. Other people say, well, maybe we should use this as an argument for limiting the scope of government control. If maybe it means that government's incompetent for certain decisions, so we should scale back what it does. Of course, libertarian-leaning people like that and non-libertarian-leaning people don't. That's a big open question. Some people say what we need to do is change how we vote. Allow people to vote with their feet rather than vote with their votes. Because when you're deciding where to move, now your decision about what politics you're subject to really matters. Like when I moved from New England to the DC area, I had to decide, am I gonna live in DC, am I gonna live in Maryland, am I gonna live in Virginia? And I had to really look into the tax base, the quality of government services, all this other stuff. I really paid a lot of attention because it has a massive impact on how my life goes. Whereas when I vote, I could vote however way I want, it would have no impact, right? I have certain political views, like for instance, I'm for drug legalization. My voting behavior has not resulted in one person spending 1 less second in jail, and it never will, right? I'm not that powerful. Another idea is like, what if we pay people to know more? So this is something often called the voter achievement exam. It's an idea by the economist Brian Kaplan. 6 weeks before the next election, the government says, there's a free exam you can take that will get you a tax benefit. It works like this. It doesn't determine whether or not you get to vote, but rather, if you take this test, it'll be on basic political questions. If you get, say, 90% or higher, you get a $1,000 tax credit. If you get between an 80 and a 90, you get a $500 tax credit. If you get between a 70 and an 80, you get a $100 tax credit. If you get lower than that, if you get a D or lower, nothing. Literally just bribe people to know. Change the incentives, right? Probably had this happened, Brexit would have gone the other way. Because we know with the Brexit vote, for instance, that it was driven by misinformation and political ignorance. I can tell you a little bit more about that later if you're interested. Some people say maybe we should have something like expert panels with veto power. Like maybe there should be a board of economic advisors who has no power to make law, but they can engage in like economic review. When the politician has an idea for a rule, they can go, that's economically illiterate, and we veto it. And then maybe they can be overridden with an extra vote. Right? That's an idea, sort of like judicial review. Some people, like Alex Guerrero at Rutgers or Claudia Lopez Guerra at University of Richmond, have argued we should use a lottery-based system. Instead of having everybody vote, where your vote doesn't make a difference, we will randomly select a small number of people, and they and only they get to vote. Because there's so few of them, now their votes matter, and they're more inclined to use their votes intelligently. And because you used a random lottery, you eliminate bias. Right? So in fact, even in the United States with like open voting, some people of different demographic groups vote at higher rates than others, and the system might be biased towards them. Randomness in lotteries can get rid of that. One final idea is something you might call enlightened preference voting. The way it works is something like this. On election day, everyone gets to vote. Your cat, your dog, your cactus, your toddler, they can all vote. It won't matter. But when you vote, you do three things. First is you tell us what you want. Then you tell us who you are. We get information about your demographics because that affects people's voting behavior. And the third thing we do is we give you a quiz of basic political knowledge. Do you know who your president is? Do you know who the vice president is? Do you know who your representative is? Et cetera, et cetera. Can you name the unemployment rate within 5 percentage points? When you have these three sets of data, this doesn't exclude anyone from voting. Everyone gets to vote. When you have these three sets of data, you can then calculate what would a demographically identical public have voted for if it were perfectly informed. In fact, this is a method that political scientists and economists have been using for decades, really, to sort of study how does information affect how people vote? How does race affect how people vote? How does income affect how people vote? So rather than making the public enlightened, we can use our actual unenlightened public, full of biased hobbits and hooligans like you and me, to simulate what the Vulcans would do. And the idea is that we do that instead. But all these things are controversial. It's not clear any of them would work. At the end of the day, we have to recognize, though, democracy doesn't quite work the way we were taught in 6th grade. We have pretty much overwhelming evidence that that model is mistaken. It has systematic flaws, and the flaws matter because, after all, what are democratic decisions about? They're not about flag colors. They're not about the national anthem. They're about matters of peace and war, prosperity and poverty, justice and injustice. It makes a difference how we vote. It makes a difference what politics does, and it would be great if we could get it right, or at least get it better. So with that, thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take your questions and comments.